on Renewing the West through Renewing Common Sense, plenary session 5. We're honored to have with us Father Paul Tarashevitz from the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin today, who is going to be speaking to us about the common sense personalism of St. John Paul II. Father Paul teaches in the Department of Philosophy of Culture at the university at Kuhl, and with many members of the department who had studied under Pope John Paul II, including Professor Piotr Yaroshinsky, who was a student of the Pope. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy his speech, as well as the topics, many of the topics for this session.
Thank you very much for the introduction. In my presentation, I'm going to support two claims. First, that the personalism of St. Pope John Paul II is framed by metaphysical philosophy of the Lublin Philosophical School, further mentioned as LPS, which makes that Wojtyła's philosophical legacy cannot be properly understood unless examined against the background of the philosophical project of the school. And my second claim is that Pope's usage of phenomenological methods fully complies with and conforms to common sense approach to reality. Let me start with introducing Karol Wojtyła as one of the founders of LPS. So in the 1950s, the Faculty of Philosophy at the Catholic University of Lublin formally consisted of many professors. There were a few who not only delivered lectures, but also contributed in conceiving and running some common project of doing philosophy. In 1954, when started to commute from Krakow to Lublin, Father Wojtyła joined a group of other three Lublin scholars, namely Świeżacki, Kalinowski, and Krompiec, in their effort to establish a philosophical school. Their collective work gave birth to LPS. In time, its name began to function as a description of the program for teaching and the style of cultivating philosophy started in the later half of 1950s. Consequently, the actual affiliation of a philosopher to LPS began to be determined by the way he or she cultivates and understands philosophy, rather than by his or her formal membership in the Faculty of Philosophy at Catholic University of Lublin. George Weigel notes that, I quote, the Lublin project was defined by a quartet of relatively young men who, in a nice piece of irony, had become professors at Catholic University, because Poland's Stalinist rulers had expelled the older teachers. Professor Kalinowski, a specialist in logic and philosophy of law, Professor Świeżacki, a historian of philosophy and follower Jacques Maritain at Księżyca, Father Krompiec, a Dominican specialist in metaphysics, and Father Wojtyła. In the Lublin philosophers were different personalities with divergent interests and academic specialities. They nonetheless achieved what Professor Świeżacki later called a rare and exceptional fruitful collaboration built around 4 agreements, which were crucial to Wojtyła's philosophical project. Wojtyła's philosophical project, in turn, was nothing but an integral part of the collective enterprise of LPS. While each of its 4 framers developed their own personal philosophical interest in private, they discussed their achievements in public to make them more coherent with the overall philosophy of the school. Wojtyła's contribution in establishing LPS may be shown by his involvement in constructing 3 pillars of the LPS philosophy. First, the appreciation for metaphysics. Both Wojtyła and his colleagues from LPS, they openly admitted the inalienableness of metaphysics in understanding the reality of personal things. Metaphysics entered Wojtyła's life when he was preparing himself for priesthood and remained with him from then on. This is how he recalled his first encounter with metaphysics. It was a manual book in a philosophy of being by Father Weiss, which he was to read for an examination. I quote. So it all really began with Weiss' book. It was Father Kusak who first gave me Weiss and told me to study him for the exam. My literary training, however, centered around the humanities, had not prepared me at all for the scholastic theses and formulas with which the manual was filled. I had to cut a path through a thick undergrowth on concepts, analysis, and axioms without even being able to identify the ground over which I was moving. After 2 months of hacking through this vegetation, I came to a clearing, to a discovery of the deep reasons for what until then I had only lived and felt. When I passed the examination, I told to my examiner that the new vision of the world which I had acquired in my struggle with the metaphysics manual was more valuable than the mark which I had obtained. It was not exaggeration. What intuition and sensibility had until then taught me about the world found solid confirmation. And after several decades of his priestly ministry in the church, he stated officially in his famous encyclical letter, Fides et Ratio, that what the contemporary world strongly needs is a philosophy of genuinely metaphysical range, capable of transcending empirical data in order to attain something absolute, ultimate, and foundational in its search for truth. Here, one might ask a question: why was metaphysics so important for John Paul II at every stage of his life? Even it was to be always present, still it was not the only metaphysical tradition which exercised his impact on his thought. For instance, for assistance in answering this question, I need to refer to G.K. Chesterton, who once said in his characteristic style, I quote, "The error is a truth become insane that opposes itself to other truths instead of looking patiently for its proper place in the organism of complete truth." In this sense, metaphysics is not just a philosophical current among others, but common compass forbidding the self-absolutization of partial perspectives. Thus, for John Paul II, metaphysics guaranteed his orthodoxy, it is the correctness of his teaching, and his Catholicity, it is his openness to the totality of truth and dialogue with other perspectives. The second pillar of LPS can be described as an association of historicism, coherentism, realism, and pragmatism. It follows that, for the LPS professors, any philosophical proposition is to be subject to a fourfold inquiry: that of the history of philosophy, methodology, metaphysics, and moral philosophy. While a historical approach to philosophy was developed by Świeżański, that of methodology by Kalinowski, that of metaphysics by Krąpiec, Wojtyła occupied himself with moral philosophy. Moral questions have loomed large in his mind for all his life. He was convinced that, I quote here, his Fides et Ratio again, no less important than research in theoretical field is research in the practical field, by which I mean the search for truth, which looks to the good which is to be performed. In acting ethically, according to a free and rightly tuned will, the human person sets foot upon the path to happiness and moves towards perfection. Here, too, it is a question of truth, end of quote. The third pillar of LPS is its personalism. In 1968, Cardinal Wojtyła wrote to his friend, Father Henri de Lubac, I quote, "I devote my very rare free moments to a work that is close to my heart and devoted to the metaphysical sense and mystery of the person. It seems to me that debate today is being played out on that level. The evil of our times consists in the first place in the kind of degradation, indeed of the pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person. This evil is even much more of the metaphysical order than of a moral order. To this disintegration planned at times by atheist ideologies, we must oppose, rather than sterile polemics, a kind of recapitulation of the inviolable mystery of the person." There is no doubt that Wojtyła was aware of the danger of collectivism, which in all its forms makes a horrible metaphysical mistake by depriving man of his substantial status and treating him as an accidental part of the social whole. His contribution in recapitulating the inviolable mystery of the person culminated in his personalism based on realist metaphysics and ethics. Regarding the above-mentioned matter, it seems difficult to consider the personalism of John Paul in separation from the philosophical project of the Lublin Philosophical School. I fully agree with George Weigel, who in one of his conference addresses evaluated it as unfinished. Definitely, the philosophical legacy of Karol Wojtyła should be taken as incomplete unless conceived as an integral department of LPS philosophy as a whole. Now let me face the problem of the phenomenology of St. John Paul. When reading the book by Weiss was his introduction to metaphysics, Karol Wojtyła was presented with phenomenology by the writings by Max Scheler. It happened, of course, before he became a leader of LPS. Why was Wojtyła attracted to Scheler? Perhaps it was because of the popularity of the German phenomenologist among Catholic thinkers. In the introduction of his book, to his book on Scheler, Wojtyła noticed that Scheler's ideas attracted the attention of Catholic thinkers for two main reasons. First, Catholic ethics had always focused on the objects of human acts, that is, on the good and value. Scheler criticized Kant for his failure to do justice to those objects of acts and proposed the ethics based on such objects. The second reason was that for Wojtyła, Scheler and the Gospel's teaching on following and imitating Christ met in their personalisms. In his biography of John Paul, George Weigel wrote that, I quote, Wojtyła had become convinced that the answer to the question, why ought I be good, were not to be found in neo-scholasticism of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Michael Waldstein, another expert in the thought of John Paul, replies that, I quote, if Wojtyła set out to study Scheler's writing in this hope, one must conclude that he was disappointed. A Christian ethics cannot be built on Scheler. The answer were not to be found in phenomenology of Scheler. The failure of Scheler's system is not due to particular problems here or there. The failure is systemic. Wojtyła clearly states that the whole difficulty is the result of phenomenological premises of the system, and we must assign the blame to these principles. Waldstein goes further. Whatever should be said in detail about Garrigou-Lagrange, it is clear that Wojtyła's book on Scheler defends Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophical ethics as the foundation for moral theology against Scheler's attempt to de-Hellenize Christian thought. Even so, however, it is undeniable fact that all over the world, Karol Wojtyła passes for a phenomenologist. for a student of Max Scheler. If we browse, for example, the internet to check the popularity of the phrase phenomenology of John Paul in comparison to another phrase, the Thomism of John Paul, the phrase with phenomenology wins, may I have your attention, 7,772, try to guess, please. 6. But even if Wojtyła deserves the name of the phenomenologist, all the advocates of this opinion have to admit that he was not faithful to phenomenology. Not only he betrayed phenomenology with Aristotelianism and Thomism, as often as he dared to appreciate metaphysics and realist ethics, but also he was disposed to do it with any other philosophical current which would be efficient in delivering an extended explanation for the reality of man. It is an explanation which would not reinterpret or modify, but rather enrich the metaphysical understanding of man. Very few are willing to admit that phenomenology was not primary but rather secondary means of doing philosophy by Wojtyła, that he was a metaphysician who reached for phenomenology to gain not a full but merely fuller grasp of man and that of reality. What I claim here is that metaphysical view of man was regarded by Wojtyła as primary and necessary but insufficient. He understood metaphysical anthropology as a cosmological approach to man, which was objectively reasonable but omitting personal factors of human life. In 1978, he wrote, I quote, "Traditional Aristotelian anthropology was based, as we know, on the definition homo est animal rationale." The definition is constructed in such a way that it excludes, when taken simply and directly, the possibility of accentuating the irreducible in the human being. It implies, at least at first glance, a belief in the reducibility of the human being to the world. The reason for maintaining such reducibility has always been the need to understand the human being. This type of understanding could be defined as cosmological. According to Wojtyła, such a cosmological anthropology needed to be complemented by a personalistic understanding of man. In the same time, he maintained that, I quote, "We should pause in the process of reduction, which leads us in the direction of understanding the human being in the world, a cosmological type of understanding, in order to understand the human being inwardly. This later type of understanding may be called personalistic. The personalistic type of understanding of human being is not the antinomy of the cosmological type, but its complement. As I mentioned earlier, the definition of the person formulated by Boëthius only marks out the metaphysical terrain for interpreting the personal subjectivity of the human being," end of quote. Thus, phenomenology became a means by which Wojtyła found his way to the irreducible in man, the irreducible which was also, as he claimed, something objective. Applying the phenomenological method occurred to be very helpful in saving human consciousness from the power of subjectivism and making it an object of realist philosophy. Exploring the human consciousness, however, needs a close cooperation of phenomenology and metaphysics. According to Rocco Buttiglione, phenomenology helps us to disentangle the intricacies of human experience, and this leads us up to the fundamental questions which properly belong to the realm of metaphysics. Metaphysics, for its part, helps phenomenology not to get lost in the maze of its interpretations. Metaphysics allows us to see, in a certain sense, the fundamental frame and the skeleton of experience, while phenomenology shows us the tendons and muscles supported by this skeleton. Together they constitute living body of philosophical experience. John Paul II was very clear in his understanding of phenomenology and its relationship to metaphysics. In his famous Memory and Identity, he strongly emphasized that, I quote, "If we wish to speak rationally about good and evil, we have to return to St. Thomas Aquinas, that is, to the philosophy of being. With the phenomenological method, for example, we can study experiences of morality, religion, and simply what it is to be human, and draw from them a significant enrichment to our knowledge. Yet we must not forget that all this analysis implicitly presupposes the reality of the absolute being and also the reality of being human, that is, of being a creature. If we do not set out from such realist presuppositions, we end up in vacuum." End of quote. I look at my watch and see that my time is consuming itself. So I ask a question here. Is there any connection between moral sense and common sense in the philosophy of John Paul? Moral sense and common sense. My answer is that yes, the bridge is the understanding. We must understand. Even if we sense, if we approach to reality or to our moral experience, inner moral experience, we have to understand what we have. The understanding is what joins both sides of the river. And now, instead of conclusion, my witness. Already it is more than a dozen years that I teach metaphysics in a diocesan seminary. My teaching experience shows that today there is no such seminarians like Karl Wojtyła, who on their own can discover the importance of metaphysics. Today the seminary professor has to persuade his students about the value of metaphysics because these feel no need for learning it. To be persuasive, the seminary professor must know to answer questions like, what's a universal value of metaphysics, or why metaphysics is needed for every man? In my opinion, effective answers to these questions are concluded in common sense personalism of Pope John Paul II. The Pope helps us and our students to understand that, although not all can be professors of metaphysics, we all need metaphysics because we all have to make decisions. We have to make choices. For decision-making involves the understanding of self, of the self and the world. Nothing is more essential for this understanding than metaphysics with its common sense approach to reality. Thank you very much for your attention.